Mid-morning, 1945. A quiet street in the American interior. The air does not smell of cordite or wet ash, but of pavement and fresh rain. A military truck idles at the curb. A German woman, a prisoner of war captured during the chaotic retreat from the Rhine, steps onto the sidewalk for a supervised work detail. She expects rationing. She expects the same grey misery that has swallowed Europe. Instead, she steps through the glass doors of a standard American market. The sensory impact is immediate. There are no empty shelves. There are pyramids of bright oranges, walls of colourful tin cans, and sacks of white flour. She moves in a trance toward the rear of the store. She stops at the meat counter. Behind the glass, massive cuts of red beef, pork loins, and cured hams sit in chilled, abundant rows. There is no queue. There are no ration coupons. In a single instant, the propaganda of the Third Reich dissolves against the reality of American logistics. Her knees give way and she collapses to the floor, crushed not by hunger, but by the terrifying sight of surplus. The collapse of one woman in a grocery aisle signaled a defeat far greater than any tactical loss on the battlefield. To understand why a simple display of meat could induce a physical collapse, we must first understand the hollowed-out world from which this prisoner came. By late 1944, the Third Reich was not just running out of fuel and ammunition, it was running out of calories. The Europe that German soldiers and support personnel left behind was a continent being slowly strangled by blockade and mismanagement. For the average citizen within the shrinking borders of the Greater German Reich, life had become a mathematical obsession with ration coupons. The vivid abundance of the early war years, fueled by plunder from occupied France and Ukraine, had vanished. In its place was the ersatz reality. Coffee was made from roasted barley and acorns. Bread was extended with sawdust and potato peels. Butter was a memory, replaced by low-grade margarine laced with coal derivatives to stretch supply. The Nazi leadership had engineered this scarcity through a monstrous strategy known as the Hungerplan, orchestrated by Herbert Bacher. The logic was brutal. The Wehrmacht would be fed at the expense of the occupied territories. Millions in the East starved so that the German soldier could receive his daily caloric allotment. But as the supply lines fractured under Allied bombing and the rail networks disintegrated, even the frontline troops began to feel the pinch. A German infantryman in 1944 was fighting on a diet that was heavy on carbohydrates and dangerously low on proteins and fats. He was fighting tired, he was fighting cold, and he was fighting hungry. More insidious than the hunger, however, was the information blockade. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine worked tirelessly to convince the German population that the rest of the world was in an even worse state. The narrative drilled into every soldier and civilian was that the Allied blockade had turned Britain and America into desperate wastelands. German newspapers ran fabricated stories of food riots in London and starvation in New York. They claimed that American soldiers were fighting only to loot European pantries because their own were empty. This was the psychological reality of the German prisoner of war. They were not merely captured soldiers, they were victims of a sealed information ecosystem. They believed that the poverty of the Reich was actually a sign of resilience compared to the collapse of the Western democracies. When a German nurse or signals auxiliary was captured near the front lines, perhaps in the chaotic pockets of the Falaise Gap or during the rapid disintegration of the Western Front, she carried with her a terrifying certainty. If Germany was starving, captivity would be a death sentence. The surrender itself was often an act of desperation driven by the belly. Reports from the Ardennes offensive showed German troops pausing during assaults, not to secure tactical objectives, but to loot American field kitchens. They stuffed their pockets with Lucky Strike cigarettes, chocolate bars, and powdered eggs, stunned by the quality of rations found on the lowest-ranking American GI. But even these battlefield discoveries were dismissed by die-hard loyalists as propaganda stunts, special rations planted to demoralize them. As these hundreds of thousands of prisoners were rounded up, processed, and marched into holding pens, they expected the worst. They prepared themselves for the Rheinwiesenlager conditions, open fields, mud, and exposure. They anticipated a continuation of the grey, gnawing hunger that had defined their existence for years. They did not know that the Allies faced a logistical problem of a different kind. There were simply too many prisoners to feed in a shattered Europe. The decision was made to ship them across the Atlantic, to the source of the supply chain. They were loaded onto Liberty ships, the rusty workhorses of the Allied merchant marine. Packed into holds, anxious and defeated, they waited for the journey to what they had been told was a starving, bombed-out wasteland. As the European coastline faded into the mist, they believed they were sailing toward a prison of scarcity. They had no concept that they were leaving a continent of famine to enter a continent of industrial-scale surplus. The journey into the enemy's heartland began in the cramped, swaying holds of Liberty ships. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States transported over 370,000 German prisoners of war across the Atlantic. For many of these men and women, the crossing itself was the first crack in their ideological armor. They expected brutal treatment, perhaps summary execution or starvation rations. Instead, they were issued life vests and fed from the ship's galley. The food was basic tinned meat, white bread, coffee, but to a stomach shrunk by years of rationing, it was a feast. The convoys moved slowly, zigzagging to avoid the very U-boat wolf packs that these soldiers had once cheered for. As the days blurred into weeks, the prisoners huddled in the bowels of the ships, speculating on what awaited them. The propaganda had been specific. America was a Jewish plutocratic ruin, its cities leveled by the miracle weapons of the Luftwaffe, its economy shattered by the war effort. They expected to see smoking craters in New York and Boston, mirroring the devastation of Hamburg and Berlin. Then came the arrival. It usually happened at night, as the ships approached the American eastern seaboard, Hampton Roads, Boston, or New York Harbor. The prisoners were allowed on deck. What they saw silenced them. For 5 years, Europe had lived in total darkness. The blackout was absolute. A single lit match could invite a bombing raid. But here, the horizon was a blazing ribbon of artificial light. Skyscrapers stood intact, their windows glowing gold against the night sky. Street lamps traced the grids of coastal cities for miles. There were no ruins. There were no craters. The American homeland was not just untouched, it was electrified and alive. One German corporal, upon seeing the lights of the New York skyline, reportedly asked a guard if the city was illuminated for a special Nazi party celebration, unable to comprehend that this was simply a Tuesday night in America. The physical evidence of the cityscape shattered the lie that the Luftwaffe had brought America to its knees. If Goebbels had lied about the bombing of New York, what else had he lied about? The shock continued as they were processed and moved inland. The sheer scale of the American continent began to weigh on them. They were loaded onto trains, not the suffocating cattle cars used by the Reich to transport prisoners and victims in the East, but passenger coaches with cushioned seats. Some were older rolling stock, pulled from retirement to handle the wartime traffic, but they were heated and functional. As the trains rolled west and south, the prisoners stared out the windows at a landscape that defied their understanding of war. They passed endless fields of corn and wheat that stretched to the horizon. They saw massive freight trains thundering past in the opposite direction, flatbeds groaning under the weight of Sherman tanks, jeeps and artillery pieces, all factory fresh and painted olive drab. In Germany, a single tank was a precious asset, Here they were being produced like automobiles. They saw towns that showed no scars of battle. They saw civilians driving cars, civilian cars with rubber tires, a luxury that had vanished in Germany years ago. They saw children playing in schoolyards, well fed and clothed. The deeper they traveled into the American interior, to camps in Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, and Oklahoma, the more the reality set in. They had not been captured by a failing state. They had been captured by a continent-sized factory that was operating at peak efficiency, seemingly undisturbed by the global conflict it was helping to decide. By the time the prisoners arrived at their final destinations, camps like Camp Aliceville in Alabama or Camp Ruston in Louisiana, they were disoriented. The barbed wire and guard towers were there, yes, but so were the barracks. They were built of fresh pine, smelling of resin and sawdust. There were mess halls with chimneys puffing smoke. The contrast between the starving, burning Europe they had left and this quiet, resource-heavy detention was jarring. They had entered the golden cage, and for the first time the soldiers of the Reich had to confront the terrifying magnitude of the enemy they had awakened. To fully appreciate the supermarket incident, we must first dismantle the mental fortress the German prisoners brought with them. The average German soldier in 1944 was not merely a combatant. He was a product of a decade-long psychological experiment. The Nazi state had successfully isolated its people from the reality of the outside world, creating a hermetically sealed bubble of belief. Within the camps, a fierce ideological war continued. The prisoners were often divided by the Americans into black, meaning ardent Nazis, grey, meaning undecided or compliant, and white, meaning anti-Nazis. The hardliners, the black prisoners, maintained a brutal discipline within the barracks. They set up kangaroo courts to punish anyone who spoke favourably of the Americans or questioned the final victory of the Reich. To these men, the American abundance was a trick. They argued that the food they were being fed was a temporary ruse to make them soft, or that the supplies were being stolen from starving American workers to bribe the prisoners. When confronted with the reality of American wealth, the hardliners defaulted to the Potemkin village defense. They claimed the trains had been routed in circles to make the country look bigger. They insisted the cars on the roads were driven by actors. They mocked the American guards as undisciplined and racially impure, clinging to their superiority complex even behind barbed wire. This denial was a survival mechanism. To admit the Americans were superior in logistics was to admit the war was already lost. However, the physical reality of the camps chipped away at this denial daily. The United States adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention of 1929, often more strictly than necessary. The convention stipulated that POWs must be fed the same quality of rations as the capturing nation's own rear echelon troops. For the US Army, this meant a diet of 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. German prisoners, accustomed to watery turnip soup, were suddenly faced with trays of scrambled eggs, bacon, white bread, milk, and stewed fruit. The hallway of waste became a common sight in camp mess halls. Trash cans filled with uneaten food because the prisoners' shrunken stomachs physically could not hold the American portions. This wastefulness shocked the Germans, who had been trained to save every crumb. It wasn't just that the Americans had food, it was that they had so much of it they didn't care about throwing it away. The Americans knew that the best way to break the Nazi spirit wasn't through interrogation, but through exposure. Camp commanders began to realize that the visual evidence of American power was more corrosive to Nazi ideology than any lecture. They allowed prisoners access to American newspapers and magazines like Life and Look. At first, the prisoners dismissed the photos of well-stocked department stores as fakes, but the sheer volume of consistency in the media began to sow doubt. This set the stage for the labor program. With millions of American men overseas, the US faced a critical labor shortage in agriculture and industry. The Geneva Convention allowed enlisted POWs to be compelled to work, provided the work was not dangerous or directly related to the war effort. Thousands of German prisoners were leased out to local farmers to harvest cotton, peanuts, corn, and wheat. This was the breach in the wall. You could hide the truth in a camp, claiming it was a special showpiece, but you couldn't fake an entire countryside. When the prisoners left the camps to work the fields, they stepped out of the golden cage and into the real America. This is where the true unraveling began. The collapse of the German worldview accelerated the moment they picked up American tools. When the prisoners were trucked out to farms in the Midwest and the Deep South to assist with the harvest, they expected to find a peasantry struggling to feed the war effort. In the Reich, agriculture was a labor of blood and sweat, increasingly reliant on elderly men, women, and millions of forced laborers from the East working the soil with draft animals because the Wehrmacht had requisitioned the trucks and fuel. In America, the prisoners encountered the internal combustion engine. They stood at the edge of vast fields in Kansas and Nebraska, watching farmers operate combine harvesters and tractors that did the work of 50 men. To a German soldier who had likely walked from Poland to France, or who had seen his unit's logistics train pulled by horses, the mechanization of American farming was terrifying. It wasn't just that the Americans had machines, it was that they had fuel to spare for them. While the panzers were running dry in the Ardennes, American farmers were burning gasoline to harvest corn. The technological disparity was undeniable. Prisoners working in canning factories saw the industrialization of food preservation on a scale that baffled them. They watched assembly lines seal millions of tins of vegetables, meat, and fruit, destined not just for the front, but for the civilian market. They realized that the blockade they had been told about was a myth. The United States wasn't under siege, it was overflowing. This exposure created a profound cognitive dissonance. They were working alongside American civilians, farmers, shopkeepers, truck drivers, who treated them with a strange lack of animosity. There was no desperate hatred here, because there was no desperate suffering. The American farmer offered the prisoner a cigarette not out of fear, but out of casual generosity. The prisoner ate lunch with the farmer's family, seeing plates piled high with meat and potatoes, realizing that this was a normal Tuesday lunch, not a holiday feast. The letters home from these prisoners reflect this shattering of reality. They wrote of lands where milk and honey flow, often using biblical terms because the reality seemed supernatural. They described breakfast tables with 3 types of jam, coffee with real sugar, and white bread that was soft and fresh. German censors often blocked these letters, fearing they would destroy morale on the home front. But the prisoners knew. The labour details also brought them closer to the towns. Small groups of trusted prisoners, often those who had shown good behaviour or were considered low risk, were sometimes taken into local communities for specific tasks or medical visits. It was on one of these excursions that the abstract concept of American logistics would cease to be a statistic and become a visceral, devastating personal experience for one specific prisoner. She had seen the fields, she had seen the trucks, but she had not yet seen the final link in the chain, the place where this abundance was sold to the common citizen. The defining moment did not happen on a battlefield, but on a quiet weekday morning in a town that had never heard a siren wail in earnest. The prisoner in question, a woman captured during the collapse of the Western Front, had been assigned to a work detail assisting the camp's medical or logistical staff. Because of the relaxed security conditions for trusted prisoners in the later stages of the war, she was authorized to accompany a guard and a driver into the local civilian sector to procure supplies that the camp commissary lacked. The journey itself was a prelude to the shock. Riding in the back of a canvas-covered truck or a staff car, She watched the American town pass by. In Germany, a town of this size would be a landscape of grey rubble, boarded up windows, and people queuing for hours for a loaf of bread. Here, the streets were paved and clean. Storefronts displayed mannequins wearing new clothes. There were cinemas with lines out the door. The normality of it was aggressive. It felt wrong, almost sinful to a mind conditioned by total war. The vehicle stopped in front of a grocery store. It was likely a chain like an A&P or a Piggly Wiggly stores that were revolutionizing retail by moving away from the clerk behind the counter model to the self-service supermarket. To a European of the 1940s, this was science fiction. In Europe, you handed a list to a grocer who rationed out goods from behind a barrier. Here, the barrier was gone. She stepped out of the vehicle, her boots hitting the pavement. The guard, likely a bored MP with a slung carbine, gestured for her to follow. She pushed open the glass door, and the bell chimed the cheerful, banal sound that marked the border between her world and theirs. The first hit was the smell. It didn't smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, or boiled cabbage. It smelled of ground coffee, vanilla, and floor wax. The lighting was fluorescent and harsh, illuminating aisles that seemed to stretch for miles. She froze in the entrance. Her eyes scanned the shelves. They were floor-to-ceiling canyons of colour. Cans of soup, boxes of cereal, jars of pickles, sacks of sugar. Not just one brand, but dozens, and not just one row, but hundreds. There were no empty spaces. If a shopper took a can, the row behind it was full. It was a self-replenishing wall of calories. She walked slowly, almost afraid to touch the items as if they were a mirage that would vanish. She saw items that had been extinct in Germany for years. Real chocolate, tropical fruits like bananas and pineapples, white flour. She watched American housewives pushing metal carts, casually tossing items in without counting coupons. They weren't fighting for food, they were browsing. The psychological pressure began to build. The lie she had lived for, that the whole world was suffering, that the sacrifice of the German people was necessary because there was no other way, began to crack under the weight of tin cans and cardboard boxes. But she held it together. She was a soldier of the Reich, after all. She could withstand the sight of fruit and coffee. She moved deeper into the store, toward the back where the refrigerated cases hummed. She turned the corner of the aisle, and that is when she saw the meat counter. It was a spectacle of raw, refrigerated violence against her worldview. Behind the curved glass of the display case lay a staggering array of protein. There were thick ribeye steaks marbled with fat. There were pork chops, pale and pink, stacked in neat pyramids. There were whole chickens, massive roasts, and coils of sausages. In 1945 Germany, meat was a currency more valuable than the Reichsmark. A family might trade a grand piano for a few pounds of pork. Here, it was simply inventory. She stood paralyzed. Her mind tried to process the logistics required to put this much fresh meat in a small town store in the middle of a war. This wasn't a special ration distribution center for the elite. It was Tuesday. The price tags were visible cents per pound. Any person off the street could walk in, put down a few coins, and walk out with a feast that would have fed a German platoon for a week. The cognitive dissonance snapped. The propaganda that had sustained her, the belief that the Reich was fighting a peer adversary, that everyone was suffering equally, shattered. The blood drained from her face. The hum of the refrigerator compressors roared in her ears. Her knees unlocked, and she crumpled. She hit the linoleum floor hard. Panic ensued. The shopkeeper and the American guard rushed to her side, assuming a medical emergency, a heart attack or a stroke. She was lifted, semi-conscious, and rushed back to the camp medical facility. When she awoke in the infirmary, the camp doctor was waiting. He began to run through the standard diagnostic questions. Was she dehydrated? Had she been working too hard in the heat? Was she ill before she left? She shook her head weakly. She looked at the American doctor and delivered a statement that would chill the camp command staff. She explained that she wasn't sick. She wasn't dehydrated. She had fainted because she had never, in her entire life, seen that much food in one place. She described the terror of the meat counter. To her, it wasn't just groceries, it was the undeniable proof of her nation's doom. She realized in that aisle that Germany wasn't just losing, it was being crushed by a civilization so wealthy that it could treat steak as a banality while waging a global war. This admission rippled up the chain of command. It forced the American officers to confront a grim reality they had only seen in intelligence reports. The starvation in Europe was total. The enemy they were fighting was a hollow shell, fueled by desperation and lies. The fainting woman in the supermarket was not an anomaly. She was the true face of the Third Reich, starved, deceived, and broken by the mere sight of a pork chop. The weapon that defeated her wasn't a Sherman tank or a B-17 bomber. It was the crushing weight of American agriculture. The report from the camp doctor was filed, but its implications went far beyond a medical diagnosis. It became a piece of anecdotal intelligence that confirmed the strategic reality. The German will to fight was being sustained by an information vacuum. Once that vacuum was breached, the ideology collapsed. The story of the woman at the meat counter was not an isolated incident. It became a parable within the camps. As word spread through the barracks, the hardline Nazi officers tried to suppress it, dismissing her as weak or mentally unstable. But they could not suppress the daily evidence on the mess hall trays. The black prisoners found their authority eroding not because of American re-education classes, but because of American breakfast. It is difficult to maintain a belief in the master race and the inevitable victory of the Reich when your captors are feeding you better than your own generals fed you at the front. The psychological casualty rate was massive. The fanaticism required to be a Nazi relied on a siege mentality, the idea that the world was against Germany, and that the suffering was shared by all. American abundance proved that the suffering was exclusively German, a result of their own leadership's choices. Historians note that for many POWs, this period marked the beginning of a profound internal crisis. They began to realize they had been swindled. The Jewish, Bolshevik, capitalist plot they had been warned about had somehow produced a society that could feed its prisoners ice cream and roast beef. The cognitive dissonance gave way to depression for some, but for others, it was a reawakening. The grey prisoners, those who were ambivalents, swung decisively against the Nazi regime. They realized that a government that could not feed its people had no right to rule them. This weapon of logistics had strategic consequences. The Americans, realizing the power of this exposure, began to facilitate it more openly. The re-education of German POWs became less about lectures on democracy and more about exposure to the fruits of democracy. Films shown in the camps were often simple newsreels of American life harvests, factory lines, city streets. The message was subtle but devastating. This is what you are fighting. This is why you are losing. The tragedy, however, lay in the communication gap. Prisoners wrote millions of letters home, desperately trying to convey the truth to their families in Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin. They described the ham, the white bread, the chocolate. But in a starving Germany, these letters were often read with disbelief or anger. Families thought their sons had gone mad or were being forced to write lies by their captors. The abyss between the reality of the US camps and the ruins of Germany was so vast that it could not be bridged by words. It could only be understood by those who had tasted the food themselves. The final act of this psychological drama played out not in the United States, but on the shattered docks of Bremerhaven and Hamburg. By 1946, the repatriation process began in earnest. The camps in the American South and Midwest were emptied. The golden cage was unlocked. For the prisoners, this moment was a paradoxical tragedy. They were regaining their freedom, but they were losing their sustenance. The journey back across the Atlantic was a somber mirror image of their arrival. They watched the American coastline disappear, taking with it the electric lights, the unblemished cities, and the overflowing granaries. They were sailing back to a continent that had effectively ceased to function. When they disembarked in Germany, the shock was absolute. The hunger winter of 1946-1994-7 was ravaging the population. The daily ration in the British and American occupation zones had dropped to under 1,000 calories, starvation levels. The former prisoners, tanned and muscular from years of American farm labour and army rations, stepped off the ships looking like giants among their own people. They found their families living in cellars beneath mountains of brick, boiling grass and scavenging for coal dust to survive. The contrast was physically painful. A former prisoner who had spent 2 years in Alabama eating 3 square meals a day now had to look his emaciated mother in the eye. He had to explain that while she was cowering in air raid shelters and eating bread made of sawdust, he had been drinking milk and harvesting corn in a land untouched by the war. This disparity, however, laid the groundwork for the future of Europe. These 370,000 returnees became the most effective ambassadors for the Western alliance that history could have produced. When the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, shipping millions of tons of food and machinery to rebuild Western Europe, the German population might have been skeptical. They had been taught for a decade to distrust American plutocracy. But the former POWs knew better. When the American relief ships arrived, the men who had worked the docks in Boston and the fields in Nebraska told their neighbors the truth. The Americans are not doing this to trick us. They have so much, they can afford to save us. The woman who fainted at the meat counter, and thousands like her, carried a memory that inoculated West Germany against the resurgence of fascism or the creeping influence of Soviet communism. They had seen the alternative. They had seen a system where the grocery stores were full and the government did not need to starve its neighbors to feed its armies. They didn't want a Fourth Reich. They wanted the American supermarket. We often study the Second World War through the lens of kinetics. We count the divisions, the tanks, and the sorties. We analyze the arc of artillery shells and the penetration values of armor. But the true story of the conflict is often found in the quiet, devastating spaces between the battles. It is found in the calorie counts of a soldier's ration pack and the yield of a Kansas wheat field. The collapse of a German woman in front of a meat counter offers a profound realization about the nature of modern conflict. The Third Reich believed that will, discipline, and racial purity were the ultimate weapons. They believed that a nation could endure any hardship if its spirit was hard enough. But they failed to understand that spirit cannot survive without sustenance. The United States did not just outfight the Axis powers, it outproduced, outshipped, and outfed them. The American supermarket was not a civilian luxury, it was a military asset as potent as the atomic bomb. It was a projection of power that declared, without a single shot being fired, that the war was mathematically unwinnable for Germany. In the end, the most effective propaganda was not a speech or a leaflet. It was a simple, unrationed steak. That image of abundance in the face of scarcity broke the ideological spine of the enemy more effectively than any interrogation ever could. It reminds us that while wars are fought by soldiers, they are won by the systems that sustain them. The woman on the floor of the grocery store was not a casualty of violence, but a casualty of the terrifying, overwhelming truth of total war.